At his own father's funeral, Police Chief Michael Stone was nearly arrested by fake officers claiming authority they didn't have. Backed by Greg Tenner, a man who ruled the neighborhood like a private kingdom, these imposters enforced fear with fabricated rules and hollow threats. But they had no idea the man they confronted was the one person capable of tearing their illusion apart. Just wait until you hear how this stunning confrontation turned into a powerful stand for justice. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cypress trees like pale gold, casting dappled shadows over the manicured grounds of Wesley Hills Cemetery. The air was still, reverent, filled only with the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional distant chirp of a mockingbird. Rows of headstones stood like silent witnesses to the gathering. It was a modest service. No pomp, no procession, just a family saying goodbye. At the center stood Michael Stone, a tall figure in crisp navy blue dress uniform, the glint of a polished badge catching stray sunbeams. But today, he was not there as chief of police. He was only a son mourning his father. His gloved hands were clasped loosely in front of him. The weight of the badge on his chest felt heavier than usual. Not because of duty, but because of memory. His father, Raymond Stone, had spent 32 years as a public defender, a quiet warrior for the forgotten, the wrongly accused, the overlooked. He taught Michael that justice wasn't about power, but principle, that the law was only as noble as the people willing to uphold it for the right reasons. And today, as the priest read softly from the book of Psalms, Michael felt the echo of those lessons in his bones. Just as the casket began its slow descent into the earth, a disturbance broke the fragile peace. Two men appeared at the edge of the burial site, cutting across the grass with the kind of practiced stride that demanded attention. Both wore dark, tactical-style uniforms, black shirts, slacks tucked into boots, heavy belts with radios, and shoulder patches bearing the letters HOA Enforcement Unit. Their presence stood out starkly against the somber backdrop of grieving family and friends. At first, Michael assumed they were off-duty officers from another district, possibly there to pay respects, but that assumption evaporated the moment he noticed one of them gesturing broadly, speaking in an assertive tone to the cemetery director. The other began pointing toward the small crowd, then directly at Michael himself. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The quiet reverence dissolved into confused murmurs. Michael stepped forward calmly, his expression measured, though his instincts were already sharpening beneath the surface. Before he could speak, one of the men approached. He was in his late 30s, tall and thick-set, a neatly trimmed beard hiding most of his face. He pulled a laminated badge from a nylon holster on his chest and held it up with theatrical importance. "Sir, you are in direct violation of Section 14B of the Homeowners Association Ordinance governing public events on managed property," he said, his tone clipped and officious. "You were required to obtain written permission to conduct a ceremony of this size within HOA jurisdictional limits." Michael blinked, momentarily thrown by the absurdity of the statement. "This is a cemetery," he replied flatly, "municipally owned, public access. We received authorization from the city and the cemetery office." "Who exactly are you?" The man didn't flinch. "I'm Officer Jared Hayes, Enforcement Division, Wesley Estates HOA. This area falls under our community code regulations. You're in breach. We've received complaints from a resident about the disturbance and unauthorized congregation." Michael glanced back at the burial. His mother was seated under a white canopy, handkerchief clutched in trembling fingers. A few guests looked on in bewildered silence, some with hands pressed to their mouths. The priest had frozen mid-verse. Every second felt surreal, like a line had been crossed, yet no one could quite grasp how or why. "We're going to need you to come with us," Hayes said, stepping forward with sudden authority. "You are temporarily detained pending further clarification." A second man moved up beside Hayes. He held a zip tie in his gloved hand, clearly intended as a makeshift restraint. That single motion changed everything. Michael's body shifted subtly, not out of fear, but control. He took a slow breath. His voice, when he spoke again, was calm, but unmistakably firmer. "You're attempting to detain a civilian during a funeral? Without cause? On city property?" "This is active enforcement," Hayes snapped. "You're obstructing." Michael looked him dead in the eye. Obstructing what exactly? Grief? For a beat, neither man replied. The second figure took another step forward, as if waiting for some cue to act. Michael's hand drifted to the inside pocket of his coat. But it wasn't for defense. It was for truth. "Let me make something very clear," he said quietly, drawing out a leather case and flipping it open with deliberate precision. The badge inside gleamed in the afternoon light, and the words etched in gold silenced every breath in the vicinity. Michael T. Stone, Chief of Police, Brighton County. No theatrics, no threat, just the weight of reality settling like lead between them. Hayes blinked. The zip tie in his partner's hand slowly lowered. Somewhere behind them, someone whispered, "Oh my God." Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Unless you have official jurisdiction, which, let's be honest, you don't, I suggest you step back, immediately." Silence fell over the cemetery again, but this time it wasn't reverent. It was stunned, and the service, once again, stood at a crossroads, between dignity and chaos, grief and confrontation, justice and something far more dangerous. Michael didn't speak at first. For a moment, it was as if he hadn't fully registered what the man in black had just said. The words hung in the air, absurd and weightless, like a joke spoken in the wrong place, at the worst possible time. But the look on the man's face was dead serious. Too serious for the setting, too serious for the occasion. A funeral, his father's funeral. "Excuse me, who exactly are you?" Michael asked, voice calm but laced with incredulity. The man straightened. "We're officers of the HOA. I'm the head of security for Wesley Estates residential community. This land falls under our association's jurisdiction." Michael blinked, not in confusion, but in disbelief. "This is a municipal cemetery," he said quietly, his voice growing firmer, lower. "Owned and operated by the city of Brighton, not a private park, not a residential zone." The second man, shorter, stockier, with a clipboard tucked under one arm, stepped forward and chimed in, "Under Section 8 of the Wesley Estates Code, any large-scale congregation requires formal notice to the board. We have every right to enforce that." Michael's hands curled into slow, controlled fists at his sides. He could feel the tension rising, like a tide, pushing against the wall of discipline he'd built over decades in uniform. But he held the line, barely. "You have no legal standing here," he said. "This isn't part of your development, and even if it were—" "You're out of compliance," the taller man interrupted, as if reading from a script, "and we are obligated to act. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us until this is resolved." Then, without further warning, the stockier one stepped around, pulling a plastic restraint from his belt and reaching for Michael's wrist. That was the moment when the atmosphere shattered. It wasn't just an interruption anymore. It wasn't even an overreach. This had become something else entirely. A direct physical attempt to detain a grieving son mid-ceremony in front of family, friends, and an open grave. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a breeze through dry leaves. Someone dropped a prayer book. A woman near the front stifled a shocked cry. Michael's mother, already pale and trembling beneath the funeral canopy, began to sob uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking as she tried to stand. Michael stepped back, sharp and fluid, his voice suddenly steel. "Don't touch me." The man hesitated, plastic tie still in hand, mouth slightly open, as if debating whether to escalate. His partner raised a hand in warning, eyes darting nervously from the crowd to Michael's uniform. Not a rental, not a costume, but the real thing. Something about that detail seemed to finally register, though not enough to stop their performance. "We're acting under internal authority," the taller man insisted. "HOA policy grants us discretion when public activity threatens peace on governed grounds." Michael stared at him, baffled. "Peace? You barged into a funeral and tried to arrest the chief mourner, and you're talking about peace?" The man didn't blink. "These are highly sensitive lands. There are ongoing zoning reviews and quiet use stipulations. We received a direct complaint." Michael's voice lowered. "From whom?" "That information is confidential." He wanted to laugh, not from amusement, but from the sheer madness of it all. Confidential complaints? Quiet use zoning? At a funeral? At a city-owned cemetery? You are detaining someone without cause, on property you have no right to enforce on, under rules that don't legally apply. Do you hear yourself? Still, they didn't back down. The one holding the plastic tie adjusted his grip, inching forward again, and Michael felt his blood rise. He scanned the scene. Rows of guests, frozen, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. The priest had taken a cautious step back, cradling his Bible like a shield. Even the groundskeepers stood wide-eyed behind the nearby hedges. His mother's soft weeping now cut through everything. That, more than anything, drove the point home. These men, whoever they were, whatever authority they believed they held, had turned a sacred moment into chaos. Their badges were patches, their uniforms fabric of false power, and their sense of control a dangerous illusion. They didn't know who they were confronting. Not yet. But Michael knew this wasn't about just stopping them. This was about principle, about standing between the people he loved and a system pretending to be the law. And now that line had been crossed. Michael's patience, already stretched thin, finally snapped into focus. Not with rage, but with the kind of chilling clarity that comes only to those who've spent years mastering control in the line of duty. His stance shifted just slightly, not enough to provoke, but enough to draw a subtle, invisible line between himself and the man in front of him. The crowd was silent, motionless, the only sound the soft breeze rustling leaves above the open grave. "I'm going to give you 3 seconds," Michael said, his voice cold, quiet, and sharp enough to cut glass, "to take your hands off me and explain who authorized this so-called enforcement." Jared Hayes, the taller of the two faux officers, squared his shoulders. He was older than his partner, maybe in his late 30s, with the worn confidence of someone who had played this role too many times and gotten away with it. His chin rose defiantly, eyes scanning Michael's uniform, though still missing the truth hidden in plain sight. "Are you threatening a recognized enforcement official?" Hayes asked, raising his voice slightly, as if volume could substitute for legitimacy. Michael didn't blink. His gaze never wavered. "You're not an officer," he replied calmly, each word deliberate and measured. "You're a man playing dress-up in a bargain bin tactical vest?" A ripple of gasps moved through the guests behind him. The quiet dignity of the funeral had long since dissolved into silent disbelief. Some people clutched one another's arms, others took cautious steps backward, unsure if they were witnessing a confrontation or something worse. Michael's mother, her face streaked with tears, was now sitting with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on her son as if holding her breath for him. Hayes bristled, his lips curling just enough to betray the first crack in his manufactured composure. His partner shifted nervously, plastic restraint still dangling uselessly in one hand. There was a sudden, collective awareness in the air. Something about Michael's tone, his posture, the weight behind his words, that suggested this man wasn't just another mourner standing up for himself. He was something else, something more. And then, without raising his voice or changing expression, Michael reached into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around the leather-bound case, familiar and worn, the edges softened from years of service. He pulled it out, held it at eye level, and flipped it open with the practiced ease of someone who never used it for intimidation. Only truth. The badge caught the sun and threw back a flash of light. Even before anyone read the inscription, the silence deepened. "Michael T. Stone," he said, projecting his voice just enough to carry, "Chief of Police, Brighton County." Gasps erupted in a chain around the gravesite. It was not the reaction to a celebrity reveal, nor a theatrical twist. It was the sound of realization, the breath of collective disbelief that turned instantly into stunned awareness. Michael held the badge steady, his voice unwavering. I came here today as a son, he continued. I wanted to lay my father to rest without drawing attention, without ceremony. But now, because of your actions, I'm being forced to act as something I never intended to be today. The weight of his words pressed down on the two men in black, like a storm cloud suddenly forming overhead. Hayes blinked rapidly, his lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came out. The second man took a step back, nearly tripping over a patch of raised stone edging along the path. I don't know who you think you're imitating, Michael said, lowering the badge slowly, but all of this, stops now. Hayes's posture faltered. The illusion of authority crumbled beneath him. The performance he'd relied on for intimidation was no match for the quiet force standing before him. Not with a real badge, not with real experience, and not with an entire funeral watching every move. One of the guests, a local business owner who'd once been the victim of HOA intimidation, murmured, "He's the real deal." Someone else whispered, "They didn't know who they were messing with." And still, Michael stood rooted in place, not moving, not advancing, because he didn't need to. The truth had already shifted the power. The moment he revealed his identity, the rules changed. What had been a mock enforcement turned into a legal incident. What had been a provocation turned into a career-ending mistake. And everyone watching knew it. I suggest, Michael said finally, voice calm but final, that you consider very carefully what you do next, because your next move will decide whether you're walking away or getting escorted into custody. Hayes didn't respond. His partner had already lowered his eyes, as if hoping to disappear into the grass. Michael stepped forward once, just once, and Hayes stepped back. The silence returned, but now it wasn't tense. It was conclusive. The moment had shifted. Control, once falsely claimed by two impostors, had returned to its rightful place. The moment the badge came into view, it was like a silent switch had flipped in the atmosphere. Jared Hayes visibly flinched. His face, once rigid and defiant, paled several shades. The man beside him, shorter, broader, the one who still clutched a useless plastic restraint, took an instinctive step back, eyes darting toward the edges of the crowd, as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. Whatever sense of command they believed they had, whatever illusion of control they had constructed from patches, uniforms, and a clipboard, collapsed in a breath. But it was already too late. From behind the rows of guests, two uniformed figures approached in synchronized motion, Officer Alex Lang and Officer Chris Medina, both in full Brighton County police attire. There was no confusion in their expressions, no hesitation in their posture. These weren't actors in borrowed authority. They were real law enforcement, and they were already briefed. The sight of them only deepened the silence that had fallen over the cemetery. Michael didn't need to turn. He simply raised his voice with quiet, practiced command. "Alex, Chris, process these two." The words struck like a signal flare. Hayes took a sharp breath and spun on his heel. He made it 2 full strides before realizing he had nowhere to go. Grass, trees, and a wall of stunned mourners marked every direction. Still, his instincts pushed him forward, boots scraping against loose gravel as he bolted toward the far corner of the burial grounds. The second man, clearly more reactive than strategic, reached into a side pouch on his belt and pulled something that looked eerily like a taser. Whether it was real, functional, or even legal was unclear, but the gesture alone was enough to ignite immediate response. "Down on the ground!" Officer Lang barked, hand already on his service weapon. "On the ground! Now!" Medina echoed, voice firm and unwavering. Hayes stumbled, trying to cut across a row of low headstones, but he didn't get far. A third command, louder, final, pierced the air. "Down! On the ground!" By then, the guests were no longer frozen in confusion. They were transfixed in shock. It felt like a scene pulled from a movie, but it was real. Surreal, yes, but undeniably real. The same peaceful hill where mourners had gathered to honor a father's life was now witnessing the swift and precise takedown of 2 impostors who had dared to turn mourning into madness. Officer Lang intercepted the man with the supposed taser. With professional control, he seized the device, restrained the arm, and brought the man to the ground with a firm, practiced motion. There was no shouting, no chaos, only efficiency and force tempered by training. The man barely resisted, muttering something unintelligible before being handcuffed face down in the grass. Hayes wasn't as lucky. He had managed to reach the iron fence bordering the cemetery when Officer Medina caught him, one arm around his shoulder, the other guiding him downward with controlled pressure. Within seconds, he too was restrained, knees pressed into the dirt, face turned away from the gathering, and then silence. The weight of his words pressed down on the two men in black, like a storm cloud suddenly forming overhead. Hayes blinked rapidly, his lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came out. The second man took a step back, nearly tripping over a patch of raised stone edging along the path. "I don't know who you think you're imitating," Michael said, lowering the badge slowly, "but all of this, stops now." Hayes's posture faltered. The illusion of authority crumbled beneath him. The performance he'd relied on for intimidation was no match for the quiet force standing before him. Not with a real badge, not with real experience, and not with an entire funeral watching every move. One of the guests, a local business owner who'd once been the victim of HOA intimidation, murmured, "He's the real deal." Someone else whispered, "They didn't know who they were messing with." And still, Michael stood rooted in place, not moving, not advancing, because he didn't need to. The truth had already shifted the power. The moment he revealed his identity, the rules changed. What had been a mock enforcement turned into a legal incident. What had been a provocation turned into a career-ending mistake. And everyone watching knew it. "I suggest," Michael said finally, voice calm but final, "that you consider very carefully what you do next, because your next move will decide whether you're walking away or getting escorted into custody." Hayes didn't respond. His partner had already lowered his eyes, as if hoping to disappear into the grass. Michael stepped forward once, just once, and Hayes stepped back. The silence returned, but now it wasn't tense. It was conclusive. The moment had shifted. Control, once falsely claimed by two imposters, had returned to its rightful place. The moment the badge came into view, it was like a silent switch had flipped in the atmosphere. Jared Hayes visibly flinched. His face, once rigid and defiant, paled several shades. The man beside him, shorter, broader, the one who still clutched a useless plastic restraint, took an instinctive step back, eyes darting toward the edges of the crowd, as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. Whatever sense of command they believed they had, whatever illusion of control they had constructed from patches, uniforms, and a clipboard, collapsed in a breath. But it was already too late. From behind the rows of guests, two uniformed figures approached in synchronized motion, Officer Alex Lang and Officer Chris Medina, both in full Brighton County police attire. There was no confusion in their expressions, no hesitation in their posture. These weren't actors in borrowed authority. They were real law enforcement, and they were already briefed. The sight of them only deepened the silence that had fallen over the cemetery. Michael didn't need to turn. He simply raised his voice with quiet, practiced command. "Alex, Chris, process these two." The words struck like a signal flare. Hayes took a sharp breath and spun on his heel. He made it 2 full strides before realizing he had nowhere to go. Grass, trees, and a wall of stunned mourners marked every direction. Still, his instincts pushed him forward, boots scraping against loose gravel as he bolted toward the far corner of the burial grounds. The second man, clearly more reactive than strategic, reached into a side pouch on his belt and pulled something that looked eerily like a taser. Whether it was real, functional, or even legal was unclear, but the gesture alone was enough to ignite immediate response. "Down on the ground!" Officer Lang barked, hand already on his service weapon. "On the ground! Now!" Medina echoed, voice firm and unwavering. Hayes stumbled, trying to cut across a row of low headstones, but he didn't get far. A third command, louder, final, pierced the air. "Down! On the ground!" By then, the guests were no longer frozen in confusion. They were transfixed in shock. It felt like a scene pulled from a movie, but it was real. Surreal, yes, but undeniably real. The same peaceful hill where mourners had gathered to honor a father's life was now witnessing the swift and precise takedown of two impostors who had dared to turn mourning into madness. Officer Lang intercepted the man with the supposed taser. With professional control, he seized the device, restrained the arm, and brought the man to the ground with a firm, practiced motion. There was no shouting, no chaos, only efficiency and force tempered by training. The man barely resisted, muttering something unintelligible before being handcuffed face down in the grass. Hayes wasn't as lucky. He had managed to reach the iron fence bordering the cemetery when Officer Medina caught him, one arm around his shoulder, the other guiding him downward with controlled pressure. Within seconds, he too was restrained, knees pressed into the dirt, face turned away from the gathering. And then silence. Absolute echoing silence. All eyes had shifted to the center of the scene, to the two men now lying prone on the cemetery lawn, their uniforms stained with grass and dust, faces flushed not from struggle, but from humiliation. A few guests exchanged stunned glances. Some whispered. Others remained motionless, as if they feared even blinking might disrupt the strange reality they'd just witnessed. The casket still rested beside the open grave, untouched amid the disturbance. Flowers, once gently placed on its lid, now lay scattered by the wind and the ripple effect of the chaos that had ensued. Yet, despite the surrealism of it all, something solid had returned. A sense of order, a return to truth. Michael stepped forward, not with triumph, not with vengeance, but with a calm clarity that filled the void left by shock. "This ends here," he said quietly, his gaze settling on the restrained forms of the impostors. "Not just for me, for this community, for every person you've harassed, intimidated, or lied to." His voice wasn't angry, it didn't need to be. It carried the weight of justice, not as a threat, but as an answer. And standing among the tombstones, with a badge in his hand and a father's memory at his back, Michael Stone didn't just take control of the moment. He reclaimed it. What began as a single incident at a funeral quickly unraveled into something far more disturbing. An intricate web of manipulation, intimidation, and fabricated authority that extended well beyond two men in counterfeit uniforms. As Michael initiated the formal investigation, pieces began falling into place with alarming clarity, each more troubling than the last. At the center of it all stood a name that kept surfacing: Greg Tenner. To most residents of the Wesley Estates community, Tenner was just the elected president of the Homeowners Association. An aging man with a deep voice, a crisp wardrobe, and a tendency to attend every meeting with a gavel in hand, even when no votes were being held. But to those who lived under his watch, he was something else entirely. A self-proclaimed enforcer of order, a man who saw bylaws as weapons, and his HOA boardroom as a courthouse. Several residents referred to him, only half-jokingly, as the sheriff. It was a nickname he neither rejected nor corrected. Michael's team began combing through official HOA documents and community reports. On the surface, everything seemed ordinary: codes of conduct, maintenance guidelines, residential expectations. But deeper within the records were signs of irregularities. Fines issued for infractions that didn't exist, citations written on properties that were outside of the HOA's governance boundary, and memos referencing policies never voted on or approved. One of the first red flags appeared in the form of a letter sent to a family that lived on the edge of the neighborhood. They had received a formal warning threatening legal action over a trampoline placed in their backyard, on land that was city-owned, not HOA-managed. The letter bore the HOA's seal and the signature of Enforcement Director Jared Hayes. Upon closer examination, the seal had been recreated using a graphic from a free online design tool, and Hayes, of course, held no official law enforcement status whatsoever. But it didn't end there. Other homeowners, emboldened by the arrest at the cemetery, began stepping forward with their own experiences. A retired teacher described how she'd been issued repeated citations for noise violations simply for hosting her grandchildren. Another couple had been approached by uniformed individuals and pressured to pay a compliance fee in cash for planting unauthorized shrubs, despite there being no such restriction on their lot. A young family, new to the neighborhood, had their visitor's car towed without warning during a birthday party, the justification being temporary disruption of neighborhood harmony. Each case followed a pattern, an appearance of authority followed by veiled threats, and ending in silence when no one pushed back. Michael's internal report made it clear the HOA leadership had stepped far outside the bounds of its mandate. The organization, under Tenner's command, had essentially manufactured its own pseudo-police force. They'd created ranks, badges, and uniforms that mimicked law enforcement, all under the guise of community security. It was a performance built on intimidation, and it had worked for years. One of the most damning discoveries came from a cache of emails recovered from the HOA's internal server. In them, Tenner corresponded regularly with his so-called enforcement team, offering instructions on how to reassert compliance through presence and language, encouraging the use of visible deterrents, like tactical vests and staged patrols near targeted homes. In one message, he referred to Michael Stone by name, days before the funeral, writing, "If the chief is showing up for that burial, make sure our guys are visible. That land's been under review anyway. Let's remind them whose rules apply." The arrogance was chilling. Even more troubling was the realization that some residents had reported these practices years earlier, but their complaints had gone unnoticed or were dismissed as neighborly disputes. No one had taken them seriously, largely because the HOA's image had always been wrapped in language of neighborhood pride and community standards. No one expected a local association to blur the lines between governance and control so recklessly. As the investigation expanded, city zoning officials confirmed what Michael suspected. Multiple properties where the HOA had been enforcing rules were never legally assigned to its jurisdiction. In some cases, they bordered HOA land. In others, they were entirely separate. Yet, homeowners in these areas had been paying fees, fines, and penalties without realizing they weren't legally obligated to comply. The documents used to justify those claims were worse than flawed. They were forged. Michael stood over the evidence, stunned not by the scope of the deception, but by how long it had gone unchecked. The funeral had only brought it to light, but the rot had been there all along, hidden beneath printed logos, formal language, and the illusion of legitimacy. This wasn't just about two men in fake uniforms. It was about a system that had been allowed to grow unchecked, empowered by fear and cloaked in regulation. It was about a man who believed himself above the law, creating his own version of it, and enforcing it not through justice, but through pressure. Greg Tenner had built his own miniature kingdom, and now, piece by piece, it was starting to fall. The days that followed weren't days of quiet reflection or mourning for Michael. They were days of action, sharp and relentless. The memory of his father's burial had been tainted not just by grief, but by intrusion, by impersonation, and by a level of audacity that demanded response. Michael didn't put away his badge after the funeral. He wore it differently now, not just as a symbol of his office, but as a promise. The injustice that had surfaced on one of the most sacred days of his life was no longer a personal insult. It was a call to duty. He launched the investigation with precision, knowing exactly where to look and what questions to ask. Officially, it began as a formal inquiry into unlawful impersonation of an officer. But within days, it expanded. Residents began stepping forward, not with confidence, but cautiously, almost fearfully. Many had kept silent for years, unsure of where to turn, uncertain whether their concerns would be heard or buried under paperwork. Michael gave them reason to speak. He set up a dedicated channel for anonymous reports. He conducted face-to-face interviews with families who had lived under the thumb of the HOA's so-called enforcement unit. A picture began to emerge, coherent, detailed, and damning. More than 30 complaints were filed in less than 2 weeks, spanning incidents from property fines based on false zoning to direct confrontations where men in dark uniforms had shown up at doorsteps, pressuring residents into compliance under threat of penalty. People who had once believed they were alone discovered they were part of something larger, a pattern, not an exception. Still, not everyone was ready to come forward. Fear lingered like smoke. Years of being told that questioning the HOA meant risking fines, property disputes, or even legal threats had created a culture of silence. But Michael's presence and the public nature of the arrest at the cemetery shifted the dynamic. The community began to realize that the authority they once feared could be challenged, and more importantly, it could be defeated. Greg Tenner, meanwhile, kept his public composure. In board meetings, he spoke of miscommunication and overzealous volunteers. He claimed the incident at the funeral was a misunderstanding, a failure in protocol, and insisted that the HOA's role had always been to promote harmony and protect property value. But Michael wasn't interested in excuses. He had read the emails. He had reviewed the fake citations. He had spoken to elderly residents who still trembled when describing uniformed strangers standing on their porches late at night, demanding access for routine inspections. When Michael finally confronted Tenner directly, it wasn't behind closed doors. It was in the HOA's own conference room during a public meeting in front of board members, residents, and local press. Tenner leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth tight with forced calm. "This is all a misinterpretation," he said smoothly. "We're just trying to maintain order. People expect us to respond when something disrupts the neighborhood." Michael kept his tone even, but his words hit like stone. Does maintaining order include threatening families with eviction, intimidating widows in their homes, or orchestrating an unlawful detention at a funeral? Tenner opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked toward the board members, searching for a lifeline. But they stayed silent. For the first time, even those who had previously stood beside him were beginning to realize the magnitude of what he'd built, and how far outside the law it had gone. Later that week, with a fully documented case in hand, Michael took the final step. He didn't delegate it. He didn't send officers in his place. He showed up at Tenner's home with a team of his own, in uniform, with the warrant in his hand and the law behind him. Neighbors watched from windows and porches as the man who had once spoken to them like a ruler was read his rights. Tenner's expression didn't show outrage, it showed disbelief. As if, even in that moment, he still thought he could explain it all away. But there was nothing left to explain. The charges included impersonation of law enforcement, unlawful detainment, harassment, and fraudulent representation of municipal authority. The case was transferred to the county court for prosecution, with Michael's department providing the bulk of the evidence. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't personal. It was justice. And it was long overdue. The announcement of Greg Tenner's arrest spread through Wesley Estates, not with chaos or outrage, but with silence. A silence so deep, so unexpected, it almost echoed. It wasn't the kind born of disbelief or fear. It was the sound of collective exhalation, of a neighborhood finally breathing out after years of holding its breath. There were no angry crowds, no protests, no defensive meetings, just stillness, like the calm after a storm that had gone on too long. People didn't cheer, they didn't celebrate in the streets, but they nodded to one another with a quiet knowing. Something had changed. Something heavy had been lifted. Michael noticed it in the small details. The way neighbors made longer eye contact when passing on the sidewalk. The way front doors stayed open a little longer in the evenings. The way voices, once guarded during conversations, now carried just a bit more freely across fences and porches. One morning, as he was walking out of the community center after a brief meeting with city officials, a woman in her 70s approached him. Her silver hair was tucked neatly under a sun hat, and she leaned slightly on a floral cane. She said nothing at first, just reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm. "You reminded them," she said softly, her voice steady despite her age. that the law still means something. You made them feel safe again." She didn't wait for a reply. She didn't need one. Word of her words spread almost as quickly as the news itself. And with that quiet confidence came something else. Stories. Dozens of them. A retired mechanic who lived near the community's north gate shared that he'd once flown a small American flag from a bracket on his porch. A week later, he'd received a notice stating the flagpole violated aesthetic balance guidelines and could result in fines. When he pushed back, he said 2 men, one of them, Hayes, visited him late in the evening and suggested that continued noncompliance might affect the HOA's view of his property's occupancy status. He removed the flag, but he never forgot. Then came Maria Alvarez, a single mother of 3 who had lived just outside the technical borders of the HOA. She shared that after missing one of the voluntary contribution payments, something the HOA encouraged even for non-member households, her water was inexplicably shut off for a full day. The utility company confirmed there had been no authorized order, but a handwritten note was found taped to her door. "Community upkeep requires commitment. Please reconsider your position." Others spoke of mysterious violations posted on their doors without explanation. Driveway chalk drawings by children labeled as graffiti. A grandfather who had built a birdhouse in his backyard and was told it posed a noise hazard. A veteran asked to take down his military emblem because it could invite aggressive symbolism. None of these infractions had legal standing, but they worked because people had been conditioned to believe they were powerless. Michael listened to every one of them, not because he was trying to build a case, he already had what he needed, but because the community needed to speak. They needed to know their voices mattered again, son. And as they spoke, something happened that Michael hadn't seen in years. They began speaking to each other. Stories were shared at bus stops, in grocery store lines, on community message boards once dominated by HOA notices. People began asking questions about their rights, about the limits of association power, about the protections their city truly offered. What had once been a rule-bound silence was giving way to informed conversation. Caution turned into confidence. One evening, Michael received a handwritten letter from a teenager named Jake. His family had recently moved in, and for months they had been quiet, unsure of how things worked in this tightly monitored neighborhood. Jake wrote about how, after the arrest, his parents let him set up a lemonade stand on the corner of their lot, something the HOA had previously discouraged for being a visual disruption. He made $15 that day, but more importantly, he said, he made 2 friends. It was a small thing, but to Michael it meant everything, because justice wasn't only about courtrooms and charges, it was about restoring the small, everyday freedoms people didn't even realize they had lost. It was about trust, something fragile but powerful when rebuilt. And in that silence that had followed the fall of the HOA's false authority, Michael didn't hear resignation. He heard healing. The morning sky was pale and cloudless, casting a soft, even light over the quiet grounds of Wesley Hills Cemetery. A gentle breeze moved through the rows of trees like a respectful whisper, rustling the branches without intrusion. 1 month had passed, 30 days since the storm, 30 days since a solemn farewell had been interrupted, dignity stolen by arrogance masquerading as order. But today there would be no such theft. Today the silence was earned. Michael stood beside his father's grave once more, this time fully in uniform. His posture was strong, but not rigid, the polished badge on his chest reflecting the sunlight with quiet purpose. He had come not as a son burdened by grief, not as a man caught between mourning and conflict, but as someone who had carried his promise through to the end. He had returned to finish what had begun in heartbreak, with peace. A new headstone had been placed, simple but solid, with his father's name etched deeply in clean serif lettering. Beneath it, the inscription read, "He stood for those who could not stand alone." Michael looked down at the stone, letting the moment stretch in respectful silence. He took a breath and exhaled slowly, his voice barely above the wind. "You always said the law should be a shield, not a club," he murmured. "I remembered, Dad. Every day since you left, I remembered." He didn't say it to make a point. He didn't need to prove anything. It wasn't for the cameras or for protocol. It was for one man, buried beneath the earth, who had lived by principle and whose final lesson had become the compass for a storm his son had never expected to face. Behind Michael stood his mother, her hand resting on the shoulder of his younger sister, Claire. She was no longer crying. Her eyes, like so many others gathered around the grave, were soft but steady. Next to them were several officers from Michael's department, uniforms pressed, hats held respectfully in hand, present not as colleagues but as family. A few neighbors stood behind them in quiet rows, the teacher, the mechanic, the single mother, the veteran, ordinary people who had once feared speaking too loudly on their own porches and now stood together in shared reflection. There were no speeches, no officials, no barriers or restrictions, just presence. The space that had once been the scene of confrontation had now become what it was always meant to be, a place of memory, of love, of closure. A small bouquet of wildflowers, hand-picked, lay gently atop the grave. They weren't part of any arrangement. Someone had brought them quietly that morning and placed them without ceremony. Their colors were simple, honest. Michael stepped back slowly, allowing his mother and sister to come forward. They placed their palms on the stone for a moment, and Claire traced the engraving with her fingertips. Behind them, not one person spoke, and yet everything was being said. In the stillness, there was no fear, no tension, no whisper of intrusion or doubt. The community, once held under the weight of silence imposed by false authority, now stood with the calm strength that comes from knowing truth had been defended and dignity restored. For the first time in weeks, Michael allowed himself to feel the full depth of what had happened. Not the fight, not the evidence, not the courtroom strategy, but the simple, quiet fact that peace had returned, not by force, but by resolve, by standing his ground, not with anger, but with integrity. He glanced once more at the grave, his expression unreadable to anyone but his father. "We finished it right," he said under his breath. Then he stepped back, turned toward the people behind him, and offered a small nod. They didn't clap, they didn't cheer, but their eyes said everything. And in that shared stillness, unspoken, unbroken, peace wasn't just felt, it was understood. Greg Tenner and his associates were each handed sentences by the county court, held accountable for the misuse of authority and the harm caused under the guise of neighborhood protection. The HOA they once operated with unchecked control was stripped of its license, its charter dissolved. Streets once patrolled by false rules and fabricated power slowly began returning to what they were always meant to be, places of quiet, of family, of everyday life free from fear. The bylaws, written without oversight, no longer held weight, and what began as a shocking confrontation beside a grave transformed into something greater, a story retold in homes, classrooms, and council meetings as proof that justice is not abstract. It lives in those willing to protect it. And in Michael Stone, a man who faced down deception without losing his compassion, the people saw that rare strength. A leader who never forgot to be a son, even when duty called him to stand for many.